So, Dr. McGrath, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me on the show.
So, I was listening to a session with J.I. Packer, and he was talking about the first time that he met you. Um, and he mentioned that shortly after meeting you, he met you on a train ride, which you talk about in the biography. And he said, like, after the train ride, which was about 2 or 3 hours, you said that you wanted to write his life. And so I was very, very curious about like that particular train ride. When you got on the train and you saw J.I. Packer, were you like assigned to sit next to him or you just like went over to sit next to him?
We had been at a meeting together in London briefly the previous day, and then we were both going from Oxford to Cambridge, and we got on the same. It was actually a coach, and we recognised each other from the meeting. So we went across, said hi, and we sat down beside each other. And it was a very long journey. We had a wonderful conversation. I began to realise this guy's really interesting. You know, I'd read some of his books, but as a person, he was really interesting. He told me all about some of the things he'd been doing, and I thought we need to get this written down. It's so interesting. So I thought, look, I'd like to write this guy's biography, and Jim very kindly agreed. So it was a fascinating conversation.
Because that's a tremendous amount of work to like do a biography. And so did you realize like what you were signing up for when you mentioned that to him?
I did. I knew what I wanted to do, and it involved reading everything he'd written. That took a long time. It also involved writing lots of letters to people who knew him, and saying, "Look, can you help me remember anything? How did Packer influence you?" and things like that. I think that I wrote 300 letters, something like that. This is before
Wow.
emails. That's a long time ago.
Wow.
And and they were really interesting. So it gave me a very good sense of just how interesting this man was.
I'm very curious about because when you get on the train ride with him, you've already read some of his writings. You obviously know him from the conference and from previous engagements. What was it about that conversation? Because that conversation was critical. That train ride was critical to the development of the two biographies you've written. What were some things that stood out to you as you chatted with him, where you're like, I need to invest part of my life into telling his story?
I knew that Jim Packer was a very significant writer, and I'd read, I think, many of his books by them. But that doesn't help you get to know the person behind the books. And as I talked to him about how he became a theologian, the impact it made on his life, I began to realize that actually, although some of that comes out in his books, not all of it did. I began to realize that actually I would get a lot more out of reading him, as would so many other people, if they knew how J.I. Packer came to be J.I. Packer and what motivated him to write these books, what his background was. And I felt that actually I owed it to him, because he's such an interesting person, to enable his readers to find out these added depths to him so they get more out of reading his books. And that actually was really my motivation for writing that biography, to enable people to understand him better and hence get more out of reading him.
So what was like your next step? So you have that chat with him. You're obviously fascinated by him, both his academic life, his spiritual life, and then him as a person. And then you mentioned all the letter writing. This is before email. So you did you just ask him like who are some people I can chat with to kind of get some backstory on your life?
Well, he did mention some people he thought I should get in touch with. But because I was based in the United Kingdom, I had lots of friends in theological education, I was able to work out pretty quickly who some of these people were and who some people were who could put me in touch with people who Jim would have worked with at various stages in his life. So some of them, those were, you knew Jim Packer very well at this stage, tell me something about what he did and so on. Some of those were, look, you know Jim well, and I want you to help me track some other people who might know him, particularly at this period, so we can really make sure we do that side of his life justice. So in effect, the biography is based on a very extensive correspondence. I tracked down people who remembered Jim from the various stages of his life, and I wove their insights into the biography.
Fantastic. And it's amazing that you're doing this during a time before we had internet. Is that right? Like this is
It was
before
just
email.
coming in, but we weren't there yet.
Yeah.
And nowadays it's so much easier, but in those days, it was basically typing letters.
What was like your response rate as you began sending off letters? Like, if you send off 10 letters, how many responses would you get?
I would get about 7 or 8. But what's good is that some of those 7 or 8 would say, "I can help." And actually, have you thought of contacting so and so because he would be very helpful, or she'd be very good. And so very often I got a cascade effect whereby one person would say, "You need to get in touch with these people as well. Here are the details. Tell them I suggested you do this." So in effect, I got entrees into these people through my correspondence.
Did you already have like a map, like certain themes that you wanted to cover, or did the themes kind of emerge through these uh, letters back and forth?
I had a chronological map. I was able to say, look, here's Jim's life, and here are the various institutions he taught at, here are the various books he wrote. So I had a pretty good sense of what happened. What I didn't know is the details of the environments he lived in, the influence he had on people there, how people who worked with him felt about him. So I felt, I need to flesh out because Jim's not just a thinker, he's a human being. I want to try and bring out the man, not just the writer. And that was very, very interesting because clearly Jim had a big impact on those who knew him.
I noticed that your biography touches very much. I mean, it goes into detail about his academic career, how he thought about these transitions to where he would go and teach, churches he would go at. I mean, you provide so much detail, which I thought was very, very fascinating, which definitely helps to get to know him personally and how thoughtful he was in his own career navigation. One of the areas that was interesting was that um, we didn't get too much in. You didn't get too much into his like, personal life with his wife. You mentioned him getting married, and we know that he had children. Um, and I know that wasn't really the concern of this particular book, but do you have any insight into kind of his relationship with his wife and his kids?
I decided deliberately, as a matter of policy, that I was writing about Packer the writer. And therefore, I felt I had to protect the privacy of his family. That in effect, that was an area which I'm sure some would find interesting, but I felt that it wasn't really something I ought to go into. I felt it would be intrusive. For example, I don't know if you know this, but Jim and Kit did not have children. They adopted children. And clearly there's a story behind that. And I felt, while that might be very interesting, I just felt that I shouldn't go there. That wasn't fair. There was absolutely nothing to worry about, but I just felt in many ways I'm telling the story of this man who um, wrote these books. And certainly I do tell the story of how Jim and Kit met. That's very interesting. And there are various points at which Kit plays a very important role in Jim's life. For example, the decision to go to Vancouver. Jim would not go to Vancouver unless he felt his family would be happy there. It's a very big issue for him. So I decided that really, while that is a very important story, I shouldn't tell it. I wasn't the right person to do it.
Yeah, and that story that you mentioned about going to Vancouver and serving at Regent College was actually very fascinating to me as you wrote about his thought process and how thoughtful he was because Packer could have been anywhere. He was being invited to go to various schools and he was so thoughtful around where he's going to be spending his academic career, where he's going to be teaching. And then what I thought also interesting that you pointed out was that not only did he want to make sure his family situation was going to be happy, that everyone felt like, yeah, this was going to be a good move. That was super important to him, which is very like a beautiful thing that Packer was like, I want to make sure
Mm.
my family is going to be happy wherever we move. So that was a huge consideration. And the other one that you mentioned in your book is that he was hesitant also about the church situation, that he was very much wanted to make sure there was an Anglican parish that he can go to. And you mentioned St. John's.
Mm.
But I thought it was very interesting that, because sometimes you think about like when you're taking a job, you're thinking about, well, there's the prestige of going to a certain university, being in a certain place. Um, but for him, it was also about spiritual life and where was he going to be nurtured spiritually. Can you talk a little bit about his move to Vancouver, and you just mentioned his family situation, but also like the spiritual situation of him for him?
Yes, it's a very good question. Let's talk about that. I mean, I was in a very fortunate position as a biographer. First of all, I was based in Oxford, so I knew an awful lot of people. And then around this time, I began to build links with Regent College, Vancouver. So I got to know the people there. One of the people I got to know was James Houston, who used to be at Oxford and then went to be in effect, founding principal of Regent College, Vancouver. And I was able to have those conversations with people to really help me see what the bigger picture was. And Jim was very unhappy about one aspect of theological education in Britain, which was it tended to be a principal and then underdogs, members of staff who did the teaching. And Jim felt very strongly there had to be a more collegial atmosphere, rather like in American faculties. And so he was looking for somewhere where they'd have this more open faculty type structure. But he preferred Canada to the United States because, if you like, it's midway between British culture and American culture. He felt that actually that would work. And here's what you need to know. You're right about Jim and church life. Jim wanted to be not an academic theologian, but somebody who interfaced with the church. Therefore, there had to be a congregation in which he could minister and do useful things. So that's a very important thing. But the other thing which is really significant was he wanted to work for somebody he could trust, somebody who in effect he felt was a known person. And Packer and James Houston knew each other. They went back to the 1940s. Would you believe it?
Wow.
That's it. I mean, they really were very old friends. In fact, Jim Houston gave the eulogy at Jim's funeral service in Vancouver, as I'm sure you know. That the friendship was that old, and in his eulogy address, James Houston described Packer as his oldest friend, and he was.
Mm.
So, see, when James Houston said to Packer, "Look, will you think of coming to Regent College, Vancouver?" Well, they knew each other. They knew they could work together. The issue was, would he like Regent College? And so, of course, he had to go and find out. But basically, this is all about a calling. It's not a career move. It's is this what I think fits in with my vision of what God is calling me to do? Which is about teaching, it's about writing books, and it's about ministering to congregations. And he wanted all three, and he got them
Mm.
there. Which is why in the more recent book, I describe his period at Vancouver as being golden years, because actually it was a very happy time. He was very settled, very productive. It was a very important period of his life.
Yeah, and what a decision. And you write about that complicated decision because he did go back and forth. Um, so I didn't know, like, interesting about that friendship was so long that obviously was very influential in helping him. Like you said, the trust factor. Is this a place where I'll enjoy being? And him getting that feedback from a friend, like saying, I think you're going to like it here, and here's why. And so I think that's very, very, very pivotal. And also, like, wasn't Regent College at the time fairly new? I think you wrote about Pinnock was there. So it was a fairly kind of a new institution at that
It was
time.
a new institution, and also, I mean, most people nowadays know about Regent College. In those days, they did not. One of the things Jim Packer did was to make it famous, because he was a very big fish at Regent College, but he was not interested in going to a prestigious institution. He wanted to go somewhere where he felt he could do what needed to be done. And if you're an author and a speaker, well, you can kind of use a place as a base from which to go and teach elsewhere. But I think Jim felt that there was a church link that was good. He'd be able to write, he'd be able to speak. But he also felt that under James Houston, Regent College would go somewhere. And he was very happy to be part of that process of growth and rise to fame. And actually, I mean, there are many very good people at Regent, but Jim, I think, did play a particularly important role in putting it on the map.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's interesting, like that that choice, because you think about like somebody in Packer's position really could go anywhere. He could definitely be speaking at and having a nice position at a prestigious university like in Oxford, like very easily. And making a decision to go to a kind of a newer school and like be part of that process. That is so important to Packer, like to be part of this very important process of setting up a proper
Mm.
school. it speaks a lot to his character because he obviously could have been to he could have been in Oxford and teaching there and been very very happy. Um, but he was very much he wanted to do something and to help shape a school like Regent.
I think it's a very good exercise in discerning vocation. Where am I meant to be? And one obvious answer is to go somewhere famous, because that's great. I think Jim was thinking more in terms of where will I be most useful? Where can I do the things that I now believe God is asking me to do? And if we look at Jim's career, for example, he didn't want to be a theological educationist. Then, through a year he spent doing something at a place in North London, he discovered he could teach and began to realize maybe I could do that. And throughout his life, we see maybe I could do that. This needs to be done. Maybe I could do it. It's all about, if you like, not a master plan from day one, but rather an emerging vision of who he was, what his gifts were, and how he could use these. And as I look at his trajectory, it makes perfect sense. He ended up at Regent College in Vancouver, and that was right. But nobody could have predicted that, because this is all about emerging. Vocation is not a single flash of insight. You see exactly what your path looks like. If you like, it's this stage, this step, this step. It's gradual. And that's what I find so fascinating about Jim's career, the way in which at each stage he's saying, I think I'm being asked to do this. And testing, seeing if it's right. And he stayed for a long time in Vancouver because he felt this is where I'm meant to be.
Yeah, I love how you talk about him loving to teach. And I'm kind of curious, what was he like as a teacher? If you sat in a room with him, with his students, what was his personality like? What type of style did he have as a teacher?
Some would call it a little bit dry. I would call it steady, methodical, comprehensive. This was somebody who knew what he was talking about and felt it very important to communicate it faithfully and effectively. And he wasn't the kind of teacher who used kind of, rhetorical gimmicks or anything like that. He was steady, he was patient. But actually, I think that was what people really valued about him. They knew this was strong meat, and they were getting it from somebody who was teaching it to them patiently. And they were more than willing to listen to him and kind of absorb this wisdom he was dispensing.
I was reading a blog recently about him at St. John's and the way that he would you explained the way he is in a classroom, being very methodical, being very, very thoughtful, just like he is when you read his books. Very intentional about every word that he's using. And I was also curious about his devotional style, how he was in a church setting. And I was reading a blog article about him teaching these small little devotional classes at a church with 20, 30 people. And I think, wow, Packer was never above anybody. It didn't matter if it's 15 people in a room, 2 people in a room. He would do that class. And that's just the type of person that he was.
That's absolutely right. And indeed, one of my correspondents who knew him very, very well, talking about his period in Bristol in England, he said, Jim, he would go and talk to a man and his dog if he thought it was worthwhile, because in effect, that was his job. He was a communicator, therefore he needed to go and talk to people. And so you do find Jim doing things which might seem very lowly, very menial, but he saw them as being important. This was his role to serve. He could speak to, thousands through his writings, but actually he would go to small church groups because he felt these were important.
Knowing God put him on the map for a lot of people. That book sold millions of copies, and the way that he expressed theology and spirituality together. And it's very hard for a theological book to become a bestseller where everyone's I want that book. And it's a book of theology, but he very much was connecting not just knowing about God, but knowing God in a relational aspect. As you look at knowing God and the impact it's had on our churches, what is it that you think just really resonated with people and why it became a bestseller?
I think it's his legacy book. It's a book for which he's going to be remembered, and rightly so. I think that as I talk to people about why they found it so compelling, what I found is people very often would begin by saying, I I'd read or I'd heard a lot of very dry academic theological stuff, and it wasn't connecting with me at all. And I'll just say, I was getting all this emotional stuff from the pulpit, and actually it wasn't really connecting with my mind. And what they found in knowing God was something which was theologically rigorous, but it was all about a relational understanding of theology. This is about deepening the quality of a Christian life. It's about not just knowing about theological doctrines, it's about knowing God better. And it's not a purely emotive or experiential thing. I mean, those ideas are there, but they are framed within this idea of to know God is to relate to God, is to experience God. It's all part of the same thing, and you can't take it to bits and say, I'll have that and not that. So if you like, it's a holistic view of the Christian faith, which stresses the importance of getting your theology right, but also what happens if you do get it right, which is this right relationship with God, which can then be applied in the whole field of spirituality. And of course, for Packer, one of the big issues is how you deal with sin, because that was a very important theme for him. And he felt that a lot of existing evangelical spiritualities didn't really engage the issue properly. So it's fascinating. And I have to say that the book has stood the test of time very well. It spoke to a lot of people at the time, and actually it still speaks to a lot of people today.
And I think what's interesting too is that book was not meant to be a book. Like, it was a collection of essays that he had written that someone suggested that it become a book. Is that right?
Well, that's right. I mean, basically, the way C.S. Lewis wrote Screwtape Letters as a series of newspaper articles and then thought, hey, it's a book. I mean, with Jim, there was no thought of a book. It was he was asked to write, I think it was 5 articles a year for a rather small magazine, evangelical magazine. I don't know what its circulation was, but it was very small. And Jim just thought, this is worthwhile. It'll help me think these questions through. So he did. And then at the end of it, he had these articles, and he thought, I could string these together and rewrite them. So there's a holistic vision here, which would make a book. And the book came second. It was not the original intention at all. And in effect, he rewrote the whole thing to increase its coherence. And actually, it's quite remarkable, I think, the way it just came together.
I love how you mentioned also how he was focused on sin, and that was an area that he felt he needed to write about. And he certainly was impacted a lot by John Owen and his writings on sin. And it's interesting how, like, in your biography, how you call out, like, how much Packer loved 17th century writers, the Puritans, John Bunyan. He loved, obviously, Calvin. I noticed a lot of Johns and also like the J's, like the J.C. Ryles. Like, he was very much attached to 17th century writers. And I'm curious, like, what kept Packer in the 17th century? So, like, what did he love about that period?
It wasn't nostalgia. Today's awful. Let's go back to the safety of the past. It's not that at all. It's much more that this period for Packer seems to have produced an approach to theology which really was theologically rigorous, but at the same time engaged real questions like, how do I deal with temptation? How do I grow in the Christian life? And I think Jim, he followed James Orr in thinking each age of Christian thought kind of has its own distinct questions that bubble up, and sometimes very good answers are given. And Packer felt that what those answers given in the 17th century by the Puritans were so good that people needed to know about them, that actually we'd lost something. And so Packer, in effect, saw himself as someone who was not asking us to go back to the past, but rather was trying to bring the wisdom of the past into the present. And hence, he tries very hard not to appear as some kind of person who's trying to hold us by the hand and say, let's go back. He's saying, no, let's stay right where we are, but let's listen to what they're saying back then, because we can take this and use it in the present. So if you like, it's his realization that there is wisdom in these writers, and he wanted to kind of help people today to discover this and learn from it.
Was that influential to you, like the way that he would just read so much of the Puritans? Was that, like, did that impact you in your own reading?
Well, it did. I mean, Jim Packer and C.S. Lewis both have a very similar method. They would say, we go back to the past, because very often books become classics for very good reasons, and we need to ask, what do people find in them and what can we learn from them? And I have to say that Packer helped me realize that going back to the past was not some kind of waste of time or exercise in pure nostalgia. It was actually saying there is wisdom there. Let's go and look for it. And I've done that, and it works. That doesn't mean every past writer is good. It just means that there's a big landscape there to explore, and every now and then you will find nuggets of gold that you can bring forward to the present day. So it's a great approach.
I'm curious about maybe some of your favorite Puritan writers or books that you'd recommend for those who have never encountered a Puritan, never picked up one of these books, and are now curious, like, oh wow, Packer really like loved the Puritans. I would love to like get started, but I'm not even sure like where to begin.
I think my advice would be not to begin immediately by reading Puritan writers, but perhaps read someone like Packer's Quest for Godliness and let him introduce them and let him sample them with you, and you can get a sense of who these people are, what they're talking about. And one of the things that Packer brings out very clearly is that actually we are individuals, and therefore we may find that this writer speaks to us more than that writer. And I don't know who my audience will be drawn to. What I can say is that Packer's Quest for Godliness will in effect lay out some of these writers and explore them with you, and you'll find that sounds good, I'm going to look at this one. So use Packer as your gateway to the Puritan writers. I think that's the best advice I can give.
That's good. Now, like Calvin very much drew on the church fathers, and I'm curious about Packer's thoughts on the church fathers. Did he read the church fathers and kind of his views on them?
Yes, he did. We had many conversations about these. I mean, and Jim very often would say to me, you know, when I was young, I used to think of the church fathers as being very well intentioned, but just simply wrong. They didn't read the Bible enough. They got things wrong. And so as he read them in more detail, he began to realize actually that they did engage in the Bible, and very often they got things right, and we needed to listen to them. So, if you like, he's someone who began with suspicions and then discovered riches. So I think that's a very important point to make. But certainly, I mean, he will point to Augustine, he point to Athanasius as writers who wrestled with big questions like the identity of Christ, the nature of grace, and the quality of their wrestlings is such that we can benefit from them today. So he certainly is articulating a theme which is very, very important and very, very characteristic of Packer, which is that, you know, in the past, people have done some very good things. We can learn from them. And again, it's this idea of being enriched by the past, but not trapped by the past. I think that's a very important approach to bear in mind.
Yeah, and it's also interesting, like as you read the church fathers, like the debates that went on, like especially in early church history, as different doctrines were debated back and forth, Pelagius and Augustine, and the way that different Christians treated each other and wrote about these different ideas. And we see this like when Packer, as he was dealt with different religious ideas that were coming around, like I'm thinking about the ECT document, the Evangelical Catholics Together. And I remember at the time it was, you know, it was very much like, I think, was that in the late 90s when that document was being circulated? And there was so much debate on both sides. And it was very, very heated. And I was thinking, like, Packer made a bold move by signing that. And now looking back, I'm like actually very, very personally, I'm very, very happy that he signed it. But back then, I was like shocked. I was like, what? How could Packer do that back then? And Packer could just not have. He could have stayed silent on it. He didn't have to sign it because it was kind of a big move for anybody to like sign on to this document. But I felt like Packer was trying to help to unite some different ideas and bring people together. But I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on the ECT document and why it was important for Packer to sign it, because he could have just remained silent and not even had to deal with the controversy and all the drama that went along with that.
I think we need to remember the political context of this. You know, Bill Clinton's become president, and people are beginning to think this might not work out well. You know, it might be that Christianity comes under pressure in the United States. Maybe there's a need for us to begin to build bridges that aren't there at the moment. And bear in mind also that Packer was at Regent College, Vancouver. He was not at one of these big denominational schools in the United States where, any suggestion you talk to Roman Catholic would have been seen as very, very suspicious. Regent College was interdenominational, and actually people were quite relaxed about some things. But even so, Packer took a risk, and he took a risk because he felt it had to be done. Actually, in doing this, he was not saying, I agree with you on everything, but I agree with you on quite a lot of things. And we can, in effect, talk about the other things, but there are things we can do on the basis of the things we have in common. And I'd suggest to you that actually, Packer, in some ways, is acting out what he found in C.S. Lewis, this idea of mere Christianity, that there are things that all Christians hold in common which are really important. We need to reaffirm those. And you can see how that plays into what he was doing. But you're right, it was very brave. It did generate controversy. People were very angry with him. I did, when I was writing to a lot of people, get some letters back, which were really quite critical of him, just saying, he shouldn't have done this, and I have to say that more recent correspondence I've had, people shows a change of mind, that actually we can now see why he did it.
Yeah. I'm also curious about his approach on theistic evolution. That's another area that, again, he could have remained silent on. He could have just, not said anything about it, but he also advocated theistic evolution. And I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on that.
I think Jim really began to advocate theistic evolution. Though, of course, he doesn't actually use that phrase. While he was in Great Britain, it just seemed to him this was an obvious way of reading scripture. His knowledge of historical theology indicated this was actually a very respectable position. And of course, he'd read Benjamin Warfield, and knew what his position was in this. So he felt this was a defensible and helpful position. When he went to North America, he went to Regent College. And again, Regent College was an interdenominational school. It was apart from the American culture wars. And actually, it was not an issue there, as it might have been, for example, at somewhere like, you can name other theological schools where might be the problem. And that was just the way Jim saw things. But you need to also bear in mind that actually, although Jim became famous in North America, actually, in many ways, he learned his theology in Britain. And in Britain, this has never been a controversy. I mean, it's always been something where we can see various options and people have been free to choose what they think is right. And actually, Jim just felt that A, his conclusions stood, and B, the fact that it wasn't a big deal also stood. And so he felt he could really bring that with him to the North American context.
Yeah. What advice do you have for? I feel like it's such a still a heated debate today, and Christians divide over this issue. What advice do you have for those that are in conversation with each other who are maybe at odds? They have different viewpoints on creation versus evolution, and I guess how can we have more grace for each other?
Well, I think I'm going to say a few things. One is that, first of all, I do understand why people are so engaged with this question, why they see it as being so important. I think that's very important. I think we also need to say very clearly, this is not a debate about the authority of the Bible. Asserting the authority of the Bible does not answer any of these questions, because the issue is, what's the right interpretation of this? And we find something like theistic evolution being talked about by church fathers. So in effect, this is not a new approach at all. It's in effect already there in tradition. But I think the third thing I would say is this. I could draw you a map of various possibilities for Christians. All of them take the Bible very, very seriously, but all of them have weak points. There's no one that's obviously right at every level. You can say this is the best way of interpreting Genesis, but actually it doesn't do very well on, for example, correlating with what we know of science. So you do have to, in effect, make a judgment about which of these is the best. And I'm prepared to respect those judgments, even though I may disagree with them. What I would say, though, is that actually this is not a matter of salvation in my view. This is a matter of how on earth we try and make sense of certain very important themes of Scripture. But there are other themes which I think we can bring to bear on this, which set them in a proper context.
Yeah, and I think you hit it right there about the authority of the Bible, and I think that's sometimes where the debates are kind of focused on, because people are not, they feel like the other person's not taking the Bible seriously, or taking the Bible in an authoritative way. What was, and certainly Packer did that. Packer took the Bible very, very seriously. It was an authority document for him. What was Packer's views on inerrancy and versus inspiration?
Well, Packer clearly thought inspiration was very, very important. The question is how you actually articulate this. And one of Jim's concerns was that the word inerrancy was unhelpful. For Jim, it meant that in effect you were talking about almost like the Bible is a matter of logic. For Jim, the key issue was you can trust this. It is reliable. So he preferred to talk about, for example, the trustworthiness of Scripture or words like that, and felt that inerrancy was actually quite a negative word. If you think about it, when he wanted to simply say, this is something we can trust, we can obey, and therefore I'd rather use other words to talk about this. And he got annoyed, actually, because he felt that he was being forced to use a certain vocabulary, which he did not feel was helpful. In fact, at one point he said, we've invented a new heresy. It's not justification by works. It's justification by words. You've got to use the right words. But I'm being asked to use a word that I don't think is helpful here.
Oh, I've never heard that before. That's actually very
Yes.
interesting.
Oh, yes.
Wow.
You have to use the right phrases. And Jim is just saying, look, I'm trying to articulate what the significance of the Bible is. If you don't mind, I'm going to use my own vocabulary because I think this expresses it rather better than the words you're asking me to use.
How did Packer deal with like the tough bits in Scripture? Maybe those passages that are discrepancies, or those passages that are very complicated.
Well, he dealt with them in a number of ways. I think because he's a scholar, very often he will say, let's look at the various ways of interpreting these, lay them out, and then explain why he chose the option he did. But you're right, there were passages, particularly those dealing with the idea of hell, sort of eternal punishment, where actually evangelicalism is going through a debate about this. And Jim positioned himself very strongly on what I would say is quite a traditional reading of this. And I think that the conversation is still ongoing. So there are a number of areas where I think Jim would take positions which people would say they can understand, but they think there are other options that need to be considered. So I think, there's a sense in which Jim would be a classic representative of certain viewpoints. But people would say, well, we're so glad he's there, but there are other ways of thinking about this. We need to find some way of making sure they're brought into the discussion as well.
It's interesting how Packer, like, on some of the controversial issues where he could have just remained silent and not having to deal with the headache and the letters and the criticism. But there are certainly issues that he wanted to discuss. He was totally okay, as you've been mentioning, with like addressing these issues and sharing different points of view. I mean, how did he feel in the midst of the criticism, in the midst of the controversy, when he was in these places where he was being picked on?
Well, clearly, he's a human being, so so this gets to you. I mean, I think we have to say that, and I think that Packer did see himself as a theologian whose job was to say, "I think it looks like this. Show me I'm wrong." You know what I mean? In other words, he felt he had a strong responsibility to tell it as he saw it, and in effect, let people debate this. And it's very important for Packer that the position that he represented was heard and taken seriously. But of course, controversy is always difficult to deal with, and Jim was not a controversialist. It wasn't his nature. If anything, he was actually quite ironic, particularly in private, I have to say. But nevertheless, he recognized that some of the things he was saying would not be universally welcomed, but he felt that they needed to be said, even if it was only to make sure things were properly discussed in the light of all the possible ways of looking at them.
I just love how, he wasn't afraid to take positions. Like you said, like maybe not wanting controversy. He didn't want to be, obviously no one wants to be criticized. And he's not looking to get into a fight. But at the same time, he is willing to stand up for what he believes in. And in that way very much like mimics like the Puritans, like speaking their
Mm.
minds,
Yep,
giving their
yep.
perspectives, and not holding back. And certainly we see that with C.S. Lewis as well. I'm not really quite sure about his relationship with C.S. Lewis. But obviously, he respected C.S. Lewis. He loved his books. C.S. Lewis was a spiritual mentor through the writings. But did they interact personally? Did they meet up?
No, I was able to find no any interaction between them at all. What I did note is that Jim, uh, when marking the centenary of C.S. Lewis's birth, wrote a very fine essay on Lewis, which sets out very clearly why he thinks Lewis is so important, while at the same time just begins to make some critical remarks, in effect, just saying that, you got to think about things, but nevertheless, Lewis is a very important person. Take him very, very seriously. So I think there's no evidence of any meeting of the two men. I just don't see how that could have happened, actually. But nevertheless, it's clear that he takes Lewis with great respect, and actually, in some ways, you could say he's doing what C.S. Lewis did. I would say, the critical reappropriation of the past, that's very much a C.S. Lewis theme. You find that in Packer as well.
Before we close, are there like anything that you couldn't cover in the book for whatever reason, like it wasn't part of his like the factual history of his life, but like things that you know about him that have like, stood out to you, like those memories that you think about that are just maybe they're really small. They're, oh, it's a little detail, but it's just like it speaks volumes about who Packer was.
Well, let me tell you about something which really interested me. Back when I were talking about his childhood, as you probably know, he had this accident as a child, which meant he couldn't play sports, so he had to read books. And an older relative loved reading Agatha Christie, and got him to read these books, and he loved them. He became a lifelong addict of crime fiction.
Oh,
And actually, I mean, and what's crime fiction all about? It's trying to make sense of a complex pattern of events. And actually, as I read Packer's theology, I can see that's what he's doing. He's in effect trying to make sense of what Scripture is saying and make sense of what life is all about. I wonder if this is all about, taking Agatha Christie, trying to make sense, trying to put the clues together to see the big picture. I just wonder if there's something there. And certainly, there's a very interesting piece, I think, in Christianity Today, where Packer talks about his love for crime fiction. And actually, I think that's a neglected aspect of his persona. It really mattered to him.
oh, I love that. That is so cool.
Yeah.
What did Packer say about your first biography? Because that came out like in 1998.
Yes, he said it was difficult for him to read because it's hard to read about yourself, but it was a reliable account of him up to that point. And of course, I did not go beyond that point, although then with this shorter book, which tries to, in effect, be like a one-stop guide to Packer's life, but more importantly, his thought, I think I'm very concerned to keep Packer's legacy alive. That is completely up to date. It talks about his final illness and death, his funeral, but it also says, and here's why we're going to remember him, and here's why we need to remember him, because actually he's left us a very important legacy.
As we close, he did some videos and some writings around aging, and I'm kind of curious about your final thoughts on Packer as he was going blind and he wasn't able to write anymore, how he dealt with aging and maybe what that taught you.
He found aging quite difficult, particularly when the macular degeneration became very bad. He couldn't read, he couldn't write. And Jim was a reader and a writer, so that was a real problem. But he did really emphasize that being a Christian is about growing old, but growing old with God. I think that was a very important point. And actually, there's one little passage he wrote where he goes back to his days as a schoolboy and he remembers his headmaster. And his headmaster was also getting very old and had no hope at all. He just waiting to die, and what's it all about? It's pointless. And Jim was saying, in effect, I do not think that I'm growing old in the presence of a gracious God who is going to stand by me through my infirmities. through my weakness. And actually, I found that very moving. Here is somebody who's facing up to the debilitating aspects of old age and is not losing hope. And certainly, the last time I saw him in Vancouver, about 18 months before he died, and we had an afternoon together. It was very, very special. And I think we knew we would never see each other again. But he was talking about this idea of hope. It's not easy, but I am aging in hope. I think he shows us it can be done. And certainly, I'm not getting younger, so I shall be remembering that myself when the time comes.
Well, I want to thank you so much for writing this the second biography, and for keeping his memory alive with us and documenting his journey academically, spiritually, in this book. Provides us a roadmap to be thinking about our own spiritual lives and our own relationships with God. So thank you so much for doing that.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out this video clip from the Delgado podcast. To get more videos like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. You can also download the full episode of each show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or your favorite podcast player. Take care.